There are handouts, the same as I sent out. Thank you. It started. Thank you. And also some of my sources, I put them in the middle. The 3 DVDs that I will be showing clippings from, and some of my other theoretical sources. So it's a pleasure to be here at the Humanities Institute at the University of Connecticut. I feel really privileged to be an external fellow this year, and to be here in front of you, such a wonderful, energetic group, presenting my proposal, my project. The title is AmorousVisions, Fluid Sexual Moments in Italian Cinema. And the words, the terms will explain themselves as we go along. And this is an emblematic image that I'm using because it's so beautiful, and it's from a film that a lot of people know, film of the 1970, by a director that is quite well known, Bertolucci. And it's a film that is based on a novel, and at the same time it sort of exceeds the fame of the novel, even though Moravia, the author of the novel, is also a very respected writer. And this image is very emblematic of what we will be talking about, these moments, sexually fluid moments, this amorous inclusiveness that appears in certain pivotal scenes of these classics of Italian film. So the intent really of my project is providing evidence for the argument that amorous inclusiveness and sexual fluidity are natural elements in the human expression of love. And using Italian cinema as an art form that bears witness to that poetic truth. And here is a little bit of what the abstract of my project is. Let's see if I can find it. This study articulates a new interpretation of pivotal scenes in selected classics of Italian cinema, based on the cultural constructs of amorous inclusiveness and sexual fluidity, elaborated in recent cultural analysis of human sexual, erotic, and amorous behavior. These classics include Bertolucci's The Conformist, where a charming hostess erotically awakens both members of a newlywed couple, and many others. Based on these new interpretive paradigms, these scenes acquire a new meaning that discloses the bisexual and polyamorous content therein. This enables more positive and complete understandings of the films as projects that artistically express love for love, or erotophilia. As an experienced scholar who charted new research fields that study love as the art of crossing beyond sexual divides and exclusivity, I am uniquely prepared to articulate these interpretations. And yes, this is a little bit on the research and contribution. Based on Deleuze's postmodern philosophy of cinema, a film scene is a movement image that stills time for future generations of viewers and can inspire transforming practices and movements. In many classics of Italian film, these scenes reflect pre-modern belief systems that precede monogamy and hetero/homonormativity. As the expression of a 20th century cinematic culture and tradition, Italian film encodes many of the contrasting beliefs that have historically characterized the multiple cultures that have inhabited the peninsula. For example, the notion that love is an art and desire is fluid was common in antiquity, when the modern concept of sexuality did not exist. This situation provides a fertile context for the study of a film's diegetic structure that pivots on scenes where the social sexual conventions of monogamy and monosexuality are momentarily suspended. Are these cinematic moments bisexual? Are they polyamorous? In this cinematic culture, a director is considered the author or auteur of a film. What do these scenes reveal about this author? Is the director's gaze coded in them? Why do the films appear so queer, even though they are not part of an LGBTQ film tradition? To what extent do new generations of viewers get to define what these moments mean? And the next slide is two sources that have really enabled my project. I'm very grateful to these two books. The first, Sex at Dawn, studies human sexuality in prehistory, making the claim that for the longest time our species was not monogamous, that monogamy begins with history, and that's why so many people have trouble adjusting to monogamy, but really our DNA is not programmed for it. And the second study, Sexual Fluidity, is a longitudinal study of 100 women during a period of 10 years that assesses the existence of a sexual orientation with a considerable amount of variations. And this is a little bit what this slide says. I don't know why it's a little out of focus. So that we understand from really these two sources established that sexual fluidity and amorous inclusive are both biological, have roots both in biology and in culture. That there is sexual orientation, but there are also variable degrees of fluidity within that orientation. There are also other studies that speak to the increasing degree of comfort that bisexual men, for example, men who behave bisexually, have with honoring their behavior, with being honest about it. And then that also in the LGBT community, really bisexuals are the largest group, often underfunded and invisible, but statistically the largest group. Okay, so when we revisit these fluid and inclusive scenes, we find that they can enable entirely new interpretations of these films. What do these scenes mean? Why are they significant? What new visions do they authorize if interpreted as cinematic moments that established an early legitimacy for behaviors subsequently found to be natural for our species? Why do we still so often perceive these behaviors as queer? Can our vision of what is natural transform to include these behaviors too? How does the authority of new science about sexual fluidity and amorous inclusiveness in humans legitimate these new visions? These are questions in my mind as I plan to revisit The Erotic Awakening on Francesca and Silvana in Riso, Amaro. The first clip you will see is a film of 1948. Italy is still in the disarray after World War II. The rice harvester of the Po River Valley are young women who are in this suspended between the patriarchal home they come from and the one that they will go to if they get married, which is probably their best option for a career. But in the meantime, they are together with other women and also working class women harvesters in the rice fields. And that's the first clip you will see. A film that is part of the period in Italian cinema called Neorealism, which has been claimed as not just a style or a school, but an epistemology. In other words, the desire of Italians to find out who they were after the fall of fascism, that at that time was considered a completely false way of being Italian. And then a scene from Bertolucci, The Conformist, that belongs to a different time in Italian film history, a time when film becomes an art that is more self-reflexive. Remember that Neorealism is documentary, it's based in documentary, non-professional actors shooting on location. In the 60s and 70s, film becomes more an elaborate art form, a form that reflects on its own way of being a film, and that also thinks back. Why did we become fascist? What happened? And so look at the microcosmic history of why someone would become a fascist, and actually we will become a hitman for Mussolini, sent to Paris to kill his former professor, who is an anti-fascist. And this is a historical novel. Carlo Rosselli is the professor who was killed. So the second film is made from the point of view of the hitman, who is actually, the point is that he is repressing the homosexual within. It's his homosexual panic, as Eve Kosovsky said, would put it, that gets him to kill this professor who, in his view, had betrayed him because he had left Rome to go to Paris and be an exile. So that's the second film. And then the third film, I want to get there a bit later. Okay, so here we have to start this clip. Okay, remember these women are in the rice harvest warehouse where they live during the harvest season in the Po River Valley. And their names are Silvana to the left, Francesca to the right. Silvana has a love affair with, the sergeant who helps control the rice harvest field is interested in Silvana, but she's not interested in him. Francesca has a lover who is actually a thief, and she wants to move away from him. So in this scene, it's the most intimate scene between the two women in the film, and you will see that it's also spectacularized. You like to watch it. Okay. And they trade partners. In a way, it's a scene of homosexual panic too, because they don't really bond with one another. They are just too afraid to go there. But the conversation is about how eventually they trade partners, and that's how the plot then evolves. And you will see that when they move, that's when the film script, the diegesis of the film, is when they talk about that. This is the mise en scène of Neorealism. There's always a lot going on. This woman is vomiting and she might be pregnant. There is an allusion to that. And you see that Francesca is very helpful.
Sta sto meglio adesso? Niente. E forse sarà il riso che ci fanno mangiare. Sì, adesso è tutta colpa del riso. Se vomito per tante ragioni. Sì, anche guardando certi musi.
This is the macchiatismo, the comedic side of.
E la collana come l'avete presa? Un giorno lui viene da me. Mi aveva messo a lavorare in un albergo. Se non pagava un debito lo mettevano dentro. Aveva studiato tutto. L'ora, dove stava la chiave. Si mise in ginocchio per convincermi. Quasi piangeva. Lei di nuovo nascosta nel materasso? Sta sicura che non la tocco più. Vorrei non averla toccata mai neppure io. Hai sentito quel sergente? Gli voglio ancora parlare. Ci ho pensato tanto. È il tuo amico, credi che verrà a riprenderti? Chi lo sa? Vedrai che viene. Stai fresca se non ritrovi la collana. Picchia.
The idea that a man would beat you was that he loved you.
Non lo so. Ragazzi,
This is about
hai detto di sì, prendete quelle senza contratto.
Okay. So then we get to the next scene. I think I've introduced it, but let me say a little more. You will see Anna and Julia. Julia is the brunette, Anna is the blonde. She's the young French wife of the professor who is in exile in Paris, Carlo Rosselli. And then, and Julia is coming from Italy as a newlywed. This is their honeymoon. But within this honeymoon, they have to do this little service for Mussolini, which is killing Carlo Rosselli. He is the hitman. Then there is a thug. So there's a pair. And of course, the professor in this film is a bit of a naive. It seems as if he hopes to be killed because perhaps that will create, like a martyr. But the wife, of course, doesn't want to be killed or her husband to be killed, and so she seduces both Marcello, the hitman, and Julia. She hopes to show them that maybe there is an alternative, that you don't have to service Mussolini with some cadavers, that maybe life is better, and maybe they can choose exile too and be free of this oppression of fascism. But then we see that that doesn't quite work because the oppression is within. It's Marcello's homosexual panic that gets him to want to kill the professor. So this is a dance where Anna is very seductive with Julia, showing her this sensualness of French life that is very contrasted with the images of fascism, are very stern, square. And then you see also a comment that the professor, so this is the hitman, and this is the professor. And notice what the hitman is going to say when he watches the women dance. This is the Marx Brothers. No, Stanley. You can see Bertolucci's style, and you can see how elaborate it is. This is nothing is accidental in this scene. See, he says, "Get them to stop." It's this projection of his inner fear. Fear of love, or fear of the complexity of love, of this inclusiveness. Okay. Okay. So let's see if I get this. Okay. So this is gets closer a little bit to what my theory is. As the new paradigms of sexual fluidity and amorous inclusiveness are put to work toward interpretations of Italian cinema whose world fame exceeds their original cultural location, these interpretations will bring up unsuspected continuities. Binaries around which human sexual, erotic, and amorous behaviors have been organized include homosexuality and heterosexuality, monogamy and polyamory, modernity and antiquity. The cultural polarizations these binaries produce are in the way of envisaging worlds beyond these binaries. Directors whose key scenes represent fluid and inclusive moments produce visions of worlds possible beyond these binaries, where love for love or erotophilia prevails over erotophobia or fear of love. A recent example of this is the fluid, inclusive three-way kiss scene in Ferzan Özpetek, The Ignorant Fairies. And I want to give you a little bit of background on this film. With this film, we get to another period in whatever periodization we want to accept of Italian cinema. And it is the period of 80s and 90s and even today, where really what characterizes Italian life is some kind of multiculturalization. In the mid-80s, Italy becomes from a paese di fuga, a country of flight, a paese ospite, a country of hospitality. So there are more people who come in than go out. It's like a reverse, right? And so then how do Italians deal with this? There is the usual atavistic fear, we have so many coasts, anybody can land on our shores, and we'll just be overwhelmed, and some of that is true. There is a sort of an inability of institutions to really understand that this is a natural thing to happen, because the legacy of colonialism in Italy in modernity is very small. Italy had a few colonies. It didn't behave very well in them, but it's not like it's used to having the people from the colonies come to it, like France or England, who've had a huge empire and they have to be used to it, right? And they already had certain institutions. They have policies of diversification, etc. Italy doesn't have that, and nobody's really prepared to make that happen. For example, in Italy, there are two ways to become naturalized. One is to wait for an amnesty, where all the years as a clandestine will count, and another one is to marry an Italian. There are no other ways. There isn't a process of naturalization like the one I've done to become an American citizen. It just doesn't exist. So this film is made by Ferzan Özpetek. You can tell the name of the director, from Turkey. He grew up in Istanbul and came to Italy at 17 and became affiliated with the legacies of Italian film traditions. You will see a lot of Bertolucci in this cinematic style, in this directorial gaze. But then he brings his own things. In other words, he looks at the typical bourgeois Italian family of today, very often with no children or one child, from the point of view of a foreigner, like sort of a different way of looking at this formation. Is not something that is just it, but something that a foreigner would notice, is something that is perhaps a bit offbeat of what one might expect. And also he looks at the other Italy, the Italy where all the fairies and the queers and the foreigners congregate because they're all marginalized. And so here we have the character Michele, who is a gay man, part of this world of fairies, foreigners, and queers. Turkish immigrants, transsexuals, single women, a gay man, they all congregate in his elective family. And then you have a bourgeois woman, Antonia, who is a doctor and has no children. What brings them together is the death of the lover they shared, Massimo, who was married to Antonia and had a 7-year affair with Michele. He dies suddenly in a car accident. He is hit by a car, and so the two grieve this loss. And of course, Michele always knew about Antonia, but Antonia never knew about Michele. However, she finds out, and she looks for the rival, and she is quite surprised to find that the rival is of a same gender as her husband. So there are two closets that are opening up. The fact that she had no idea that her husband was actually practicing some form of bisexuality. Okay, and so the whole film is about how this push and pull, where they're attracted. Why? Because they want to know who their lover was. They didn't know one half of him, as they discover, so they want the whole picture. It's that, erotophilia that wants them to come together and find out who they really loved. And then there is that erotophobia, where they're really afraid to find out who this person is, and so they repel each other, and all the stereotypes come into play, like he's a frocio and she's a frigida, all these. So this is the final scene. And we have to say that she is really attracted to this family of fairies, foreigners, and queers, because it's a very lively, imaginative family, whereas her family is, very, very dry. She's very alone now in her house. So this is the final scene, or almost final scene, where she has invited him for dinner to this house that for him was a mirage, a place where he would never be admitted. And he finds out that this man he lost loved his wife, that it wasn't a front or a fiction. So from looking around, he becomes aware of that, and then he asks for her forgiveness. And then you see what I call a three-way kiss, because very adeptly, Özpetek pastes a cut of the face of their lover, so that he enters the fantasy world. When they kiss each other, they're actually kissing the memory of this man they're grieving. So it takes a while to get there, but I'll indicate it to you. It's very subtle. It's subliminal. Finally, he emotes and sees the reality of his marriage and an authentic partnership of equals. Okay, and first you see the two men kissing. It will be in a moment. You see his fantasy of kissing the deceased Massimo. Here. Okay, so you see his fantasy. Now you will see her fantasy. And the same face of late Massimo comes in. And then they stop. They're a little embarrassed. Okay. She starts laughing. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation. I have $1 million question. And that is, how can we create a world where Massimo, the shared lover who binds Antonia and Michele erotically, wouldn't have to be dead for Antonia and Michele to kiss? And how can humanities-based interdisciplinary research help to make this happen? This is a very provocative question. And I think I have a list of sources that you can find, and then